America 1950 versus America 2020. If you could go back to 1950, would you do it? There would be no internet, no cell phones, and you would only be able to watch television in black and white. But even though they lacked many of our modern conveniences, people genuinely seemed to be much happier back then. Families actually ate dinner together. Neighbors knew and cared about one another. And being an American truly meant something. Today, we like to think that we are so much more advanced than we were back then, but the truth is that our society is in the process of falling apart all around us. Could it be possible that we could learn some important lessons by looking back at how Americans lived 70 years ago? Of course, there has never been any era in our history where everything has been perfect. But without a doubt, things are vastly different today than they were back in 1950. In 1950, Texaco Star Theater, The Lone Ranger, and Hopalong Cassidy were some of the most popular shows that Americans watched on television. In 2020, a Netflix film entitled Cuties is so trashy and so disgusting that 4 states have sent a letter to Netflix asking for it to be removed because it is, quote, fodder for those with criminal imaginations, serving to normalize the view that children are sexual beings, end quote. In 1950, television networks would not even show husbands and wives in bed together. In 2020, adult websites get more traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. In 1950, people would greet one another as they walked down the street. In 2020, Americans are too enamored with their cell phones to be bothered with actual human contact. In 1950, chewing gum and talking in class were some of the major disciplinary problems in our schools. In 2020, kids are literally gunning down police officers in the streets. In 1950, people would make an effort to dress up and look nice when they would go out in public. In 2020, most of the population has become utter slobs, and People of Walmart has become one of our most popular memes. In 1950, the typical woman got married for the first time at age 20, and the typical man got married for the first time at age 22. In 2020, the typical woman gets married for the first time at age 27, and the typical man gets married for the first time at age 29. In 1950, a lot of people would leave their homes and their vehicles unlocked because crime rates were so low. In 2020, many that live in urban areas are deathly afraid of all the civil unrest that has erupted, and gun sales have soared to an all-time record high. In 1950, Americans actually attempted to parent their children. In 2020, we pump our kids full of mind-altering drugs, and we let our televisions and our video games raise our children. In 1950, Baltimore was one of the most beautiful and most prosperous cities on the entire planet. In 2020, Baltimore regularly makes headlines because of all the murders that are constantly occurring. Of course, the exact same thing could be said about many of our other major cities. In 1950, 78% of all households in America contained a married couple. In 2020, that figure has fallen below 50%. In 1950, about 5% of all babies in the United States were born to unmarried parents. In 2020, about 40% of all babies in the United States will be born to unmarried parents. In 1950, new churches were regularly being opened all over the United States. In 2020, it is being projected that 1 out of every 5 churches in the U.S. could be forced to shut their doors in the next 18 months. And the mayor of Lubbock, Texas, just said that opening a new Planned Parenthood clinic is like starting a church. In 1950, we actually had high standards for our elected officials, and people actually did research on the candidates before they cast their votes. In 2020, More than 4,000 people in one county in New Hampshire voted for a transsexual Satanist anarchist in the Republican primary, and she is now the Republican nominee for sheriff in Cheshire County. In 1950, children would go outside and play when they got home from school. In 2020, our parks and our playgrounds are virtually empty, and we have the highest childhood obesity rate in the industrialized world. In 1950, front porches were community gathering areas, and people would regularly have their neighbors over for dinner. In 2020, many of us don't know our neighbors at all, and the average American watches more than 5 hours of television a day. In 1950, Americans used words such as knucklehead, moxie, and jalopy. In 2020, new terms such as nomophobia, people kind, and social distancing have been introduced into the English language. In 1950, the very first credit card was issued in the United States. In 2020, Americans owe more than $930 billion on their credit cards. In 1950, one income could support an entire middle-class household. In 2020, tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs and filed for unemployment, and more than half of all households in some of the largest cities are currently facing serious financial problems. In 1950, the American people believed that the free market should govern the economy. In 2020, most Americans seem to believe that the government in Washington and the Federal Reserve must endlessly manage the economy. In 1950, socialists and communists were considered to be our greatest national enemies. In 2020, most of our politicians in Washington have eagerly embraced socialist and communist policy goals. In 1950, the U.S. Constitution was deeply loved and highly revered. In 2020, anyone that actually admits to being a constitutionalist is considered to be a potential domestic terrorist. In 1950, the United States loaned more money to the rest of the world than anybody else. In 2020, the United States owes more money to the rest of the world than anybody else. In 1950, the total U.S. national debt reached the $257 billion mark for the first time in our history. In 2020, we added $864 billion to the national debt in the month of June alone. In other words, we added over 3 times more to the national debt in that 1 month than the total amount of debt that has been accumulated from the founding of our nation all the way to 1950. In 1950, most Americans were generally happy with their lives. In 2020, the suicide rate is at an all-time record high, and it has been rising every single year since 2007. A lot has changed in the last 70 years, and one might say that we've come from the best of times to the worst of times. Today, for most of the world, it is a time of uncertainty, a time where daily headlines are full of stories of death and violence, and there is an unsettling sense of doom with no hope and no way of escape from all of this madness that we call 2020. But there is hope, and that's Jesus Christ. And He is our only hope. Approximately 2,000 years ago, Jesus' disciples came to Him with this question: when will the end of this present evil age come? And when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Matthew 24:3. Jesus then began explaining what would happen during the end times preceding His return. Even though the Bible does not give a specific date for when Christ will come back to earth, and even says we can't know the day and hour, Matthew 24:36, it does predict what conditions will be like at this pivotal point. Jesus said, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Matthew 24, 4 through 9. He also said there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Luke 21, 25 and 26. Fast forward to present day, and we find the world is seeing all these predicted end-time signs happening, just as Jesus predicted. Never in the history of the world have so many forces, including economic, scientific, technologic, ecologic, cultural, geopolitical, moral, spiritual, and religious, converged together to bring this world that's already teetering on the edge of the abyss to the point of no return. We are living on the edge of forever, and you alone decide your fate. Ask Jesus into your heart today.